This is a short video on how to replace the gauges in the LCS panels. You'll need a few tools to get started, a couple of wrenches for the nut and also a wrench for the elbow on the back of the gauge. You'll also need a nut driver 3/8 inch to remove the plastic nuts on the back of the gauge. Removing the gauge. Removing the gauge will take the two wrenches to break the union nut loose. When you're doing this, try to keep the two wrenches as close together as possible. Do not let the wrench float up too high on the elbow. Kind of keep them tight. Then remove the two plastic nuts on the back. Again, leaving the union nut intact at this point, just loosened. Once the nuts are off, the brackets can be removed. At this point, you want to hold the gauge from the front of the panel, remove the union nut completely, and the gauge will be able to be pulled out from the front of the panel. Next portion will be reinstalling the new gauge. You'll find that the gauge you received has a red arrow located at the 12 o'clock position. If you need to relocate this red arrow, it's best to do prior to gauge installation. What you want to do is loosen the small Phillips head screw at the top of the red arrow, just a turn or two, don't remove it all the way out. Grab a flat edge screwdriver. You're going to want to pry it up from the back side and it should snap off. Once it's snapped off, what you want to do is relocate that red pointer into the desired pressure mark that you want it in. You're going to hook the red pointer kind of on the back of the stainless steel bezel and then press it downward onto the bezel. It should snap into place. Once it's snapped into place, you give the Phillips head screw a couple of turns to tighten it down. Just snug her on down and you're good to go. Once the red hand has been installed, it's time to install the gauge into the board. Insert the gauge from the front side of the panel, lining up the elbow with the tube coming up from the bottom. This is very important that the tube coming up from the bottom, this union right here, is in line. You have to make sure that the tubing is entering the gauge straight from the bottom, from the left to the right, from the back to the front. If this is not done, it can cause undue torque or tension on that back elbow. So this can cause accuracy issues with the gauge. So it's very important that the tailpiece is lined up correctly. Sometimes what you can use is, here I use a wrench to bend the tubing slightly to the left or to the right. Then I reinstall the gauge fully from the front, still off a little bit. I can tweak it over this way. This may or may not need to be done as you put it in, but it's very important that the tube is lined up completely with the threading on the top there prior to even tightening down or installing the gauge. Now I'm straight from the front, the back, the left to the right, and the union nut should spin on freely with your hand. Then you know you have it lined up correctly. Next, we must tighten down the union nut. This is done with two wrenches. You have to hold back. You do not want the gauge to twist in the panel even though it's not mounted. So here you're going to tighten down the nut. Once the nut is tightened down, you need to take a look at the front of the panel. You can see how this gauge is not sitting flush in the panel. It can be twisted to the left or to the right. It can be twisted off the top or the bottom of the gauge. The gauge needs to be sitting flush in the front of the panel after it is tightened down before you install the U-clamp or brackets to hold the thing in the panel. If it is not adjusted correctly, you'll need to make some adjustments from the back side on the tubing to make sure that it is sitting flush in the panel. Sometimes you can do this just by twisting the tubing on the back side, or sometimes you have to remove the gauge, make tubing adjustments, and then tighten down the gauge again. It is a bit of an art to get it in there correctly, but by doing this, you will ensure that the gauge will operate correctly with no issues. Once this is done, you can reinstall the U-clamp brackets from the back side. There should be 2 of them. Slide them over the 1024 studs, reinstall the nuts. When tightening these down, they should be tightened down to a point where the U-clamp is snug. You don't want to have them loose, but you certainly don't want to over-tight them, where you can risk stripping out the stud or cracking the case. So tighten them down enough where they don't move, but you don't want to start bending the U-clamp as you tighten it down as well. Once the U-clamps are tightened, they should be in line as shown here. You don't want them crooked or cocked. Once the gauge is installed, take a look at the front, make sure there's no gaps, and that should take care of the end of the gauge installation portion. If you have any questions on anything regarding the installation of the gauge, you can certainly give us a call here at Thuemling.